Okay. Good morning, everybody. This is our world, this is our home, and it's 4.5 billion years old. And if we took that amount of time and we condensed it into 24 hours, with a nanosecond past midnight being Big Bang, and we took those whole 4.5 billion years and condensed it into 24 hours, at about 6 o'clock in the evening, the first multicellular organisms would have appeared. Somewhere around 9 o'clock in the evening, fish would have appeared. Somewhere around 10 o'clock, insects would have appeared. At about 11 o'clock, dinosaurs came and went, really very quickly indeed. About 10 to midnight, the first mammals appeared on Earth. And in the very, very last 5 seconds of the day, humankind appeared on planet Earth. And humankind had been around on planet Earth for, give or take, about 240,000 years. And if we took those 240,000 years, very conveniently divides nicely, into a 24-hour period, once again, where human life started at a nanosecond past midnight, what we would find is that somewhere around noon, we were still hunter-gatherers. That's already halfway through our time. Around 6 o'clock in the evening, we left Africa, and at about 11 o'clock at night, we invented the wheel. And it wasn't until the last minute of the last hour of the day that the Industrial Revolution took place. And it was in the last 10 seconds of the last minute of the last hour on that day that we depleted the energy and resources that we had on the planet completely, almost completely. And a large player, systemic player, in what we achieved in the last 10 seconds of that last day was business. And although business has given us some amazing transformations and some amazing progress, it has also been responsible for the depletion of resources and the depletion of energy that we find on our planet. And what I want to share with you today is the story that is being fed back to me by the business owners that I am lucky enough to work with, from large organisations to small organisations and start-up organisations. What business leaders are saying to me is that their greatest challenge at the moment is the speed of change. And if we think about 4.5 million years, right down to the last 10 seconds of that day, what is really noticeable is just how exponential the speed of change has been since human beings arrived on the planet. And what business leaders are saying to me is not that their challenges are about cash flow or profit or growing markets. It is more like this. And what's really going on at the moment is volatility, uncertainty, change, and ambiguity. And the question that they are trying to answer is, how do we make sense of what is going on at the moment? How do we survive and keep our businesses afloat whilst we look into the future and try to work out what's coming at us that we can't see and we can no longer predict? This is the Anthropocene era, where humankind has had a greater impact on the resources of the planet than we can currently regenerate. And so, given that I am a problem solver, a joiner of dots, a storyteller and an Imagineer, I put my problem solving hat on when somebody comes up with big questions like that and do my very best to try and sort out what's going on and come up with a solution. And as you can probably guess, this is not going to end particularly well, because I haven't particularly come up with a solution. But what I have noticed is one really important thread that weaves its way through perhaps the last 100 and 150 years of the human impact on the planet, and it's this. It's about a flaw in our thinking process that seemed to emerge perhaps some 100 years ago, and it is fundamentally about disconnection, separation, and silo mentality thinking. And it shows up in the following ways. The first way that it shows up is with ecological disconnection. And ecological disconnection has given us runaway climate change, deforestation at a large rate of knots. It has meant pollution on a grand scale, where rivers in the Amazon are currently running black with oil. It has given us biodiversity loss, where 95% of the species are currently under significant threat on the planet. We have polluted our oceans with vast quantities of plastic that's lying not only on the bottom but in small particles in the oceans. And our separation from nature has created an enormous mountain of non-degradable waste that shows up most often in the global south rather than the global north, where it is created. And if you want to put a figure on this disconnection from nature, it's 1.5. We currently use 1.5 planets worth of resources, and that's for 7 billion people. And as the forecast is due to arrive at 9 billion people by 2050, this is not going to get better. This is just going to get worse. The other area that shows up with disconnection is social disconnection. And that often shows up most strongly within our economic and financial models, where business has created people, the 1%, who own more wealth than the rest of the 99% on the planet put together. It shows up through injustice. It shows up through inequality and inequity. And at some points in time, it feels, I don't know if you feel this, that we're sitting on the very edge of potential chaos and anarchy as war, disconnection, anger, and fear breaks out in many different ways all across the planet. And the final area that this shows up is a spiritual disconnection. That's us from ourselves. So we have ecological disconnection, us from nature, disconnection between people to people, and spiritual disconnection. And this may well be the least talked about of the three, but in many ways it's almost the most important. We are today the most addicted, the most obese, the most medicated cohort in the history of humankind. And the reason that spiritual disconnection is potentially the most important of the three is if we consider, when we think back to the exponential speed of change that business owners are dealing with, there's one other thing that is also changing with exponential speed, and that is human consciousness. Human consciousness is accelerating at the same pace as everything else that is going on. So if we think about in psychological development and conscious development terms, normally what psychology recognizes is that somewhere around our mid-40s, we start to reach a potential for self-actualization. And that is when meaning and purpose becomes more important to us. And generally, it arrives somewhere around our mid-40s and our mid-50s. And though I don't have the evidence to prove it, there is plenty of evidence to show that this is accelerating at the same speed as everything else, and it is coming to people at a younger age than it has been traditional for the rest of us. Millennials are a particular group in point. They are around their 20s, and they are people that, unlike perhaps us, are showing at a very early and young age that they are motivated by meaning and purpose. These are people who would much prefer to work for a company with social and environmental purpose. They are people that believe business should have a purpose and should have an impact on the social and environmental challenges of our planet. And as always, when the pupil is ready, the teacher will appear. What has arrived for us is a template with which we can address some of the grand challenges that we currently face on the planet, and it's the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. There are 17 of these goals, and within these goals are incorporated many of the greatest challenges that we face at the moment, but also the greatest opportunities, particularly for business. It's a truism to say that where there's muck, or where there are problems, in this case, there is grass. Most of the profit to be made lies somewhere within the challenges of the global goals for the future, and along with a better future for our planet. So, having considered and looked at what is going on, the best answer that I can come up with currently that could act as a bridge to help us reach that future that we can't imagine and that we can't see is activating purpose, and particularly activating purpose in business. Why business? If we think about all of the systemic players that there are on the planet today, politicians, technology, academia, there's only one system that actually produces resources, and that's business. And until some incredibly bright person, who's way brighter than me, finds a way to create a different economic and financial system, we are going to need resources to tackle these problems. So I believe activating purpose in business is going to be a way to help us step into that uncertain future. And here is where it's happening. So let me kind of start at the top. One of the biggest companies on the planet, Unilever, has a program called Sustainable Living Brands, and that includes brands like Ben & Jerry's, like Dove, like Lifebuoy, like Vaseline, and they are all activating purpose in different ways. They're tackling it in different ways, depending on what is relevant to their brand. And here's the important point. In 2014, these brands accounted for 40% of the whole of Unilever's growth. In 2015, they accounted for 50% of all of Unilever's growth. And just in case you think this is something that is only for global businesses, this is a small company that I work with who is a lavender producer in West Sussex. They started out 15 years ago by making lavender bars and selling them in farmers' markets in the cold, freezing or boiling hot as it is today weather. And they came to me with a problem and a challenge, which most of us would like to have, which was that they had so many different opportunities to expand, regional to multi-regional, regional to national, regional into Europe, regional into China, regional into the United States and Canada, but they didn't have a template for making a decision as to how they could expand. So using the template of the Sustainable Development Goals, we asked all of their stakeholder groups a question, which is, what do you care about? What do you care about? What actually breaks your heart for the future of the planet? What do you worry about for the future of your children and your grandchildren? And perhaps unsurprisingly for a lavender company, what they came back with is, we really care about biodiversity loss. And specifically within biodiversity loss, what we care about is bees, is the collapse of bee colonies around the world. So what they did, all things being equal, obviously as business you're not going to go into a market where there's not a profit to be made, they have used the Sustainable Development Goals and purpose as being there for bees rather than being there to sell lavender products. And they have created new business streams by training people in how to look after bees, by working with schools, and they are going to expand globally based on the idea that they will go to the locations where bee colony collapse is most significant. So that is going to be the purpose for the future of their business. We have people coming from different areas and different silos. A company called Novozymes, set up by a former activist from Greenpeace, who realised that although activism and NGOs had a significant impact in the last part of the 20th century, it is business with its ability to scale and its ability to create resource that is going to have the biggest impact. Novozymes creates biological solutions by using enzymes and, I'm going to use the wrong word now, but I want to say biosomes, but I'm sure that's the wrong word. And they can actually improve industrial performance. So for example, in the production of jeans and all of the clothes that we wear, an enormous amount of water is used, an enormous amount of chemicals and waste is produced. By using enzymes, they can significantly make a difference to the amount of water that is used in the production of jeans. Similarly, in the production of leather. Now, it actually turns out these days that you could replace that process completely by using pineapple husks. We can now replicate leather using natural materials. But this is a step forward for business, and this is a different type of player. So we've looked at global corporations, we've looked at small corporations, we've looked at small startups. Here is another startup. This is a millennial entrepreneur who has created a clean tech business from creating flooring which can capture kinetic energy. This is going into places like Downing Street, Oxford Street, the White House, it's in airports. Anywhere that there is footfall, you can now create energy for lighting. This is going to be a huge impact in creating the sustainable cities of the future. Education is beginning to move towards getting involved. Peter Diamandis, who is the founder of Singularity University in the United States, it exists solely to collect the brightest and best brains from around the planet to train them to build businesses that are going to make a difference to a billion lives. He also has the X Prize, and currently one of the X Prizes on offer is a $20 million contract for the creative entrepreneur who can draw down carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and turn it into useful products. Now, I'm not entirely sure that yellow sunglasses are the most useful products, but there is something else that we can do. How are we going to build those, activate purpose within business? We also need to look for inspiration to do things in a different way. And where we can look for inspiration is to nature. If we consider that disconnection has been the key theme that has been running through the last 100 years, what if we looked for inspiration about connection? And luckily, we are surrounded by a system, the most intelligent system on the planet, that completely understands how connection works. Despite what you may think Darwin has actually said about competition being the dominant model in nature, that is not strictly true. It was taken slightly out of context and leapt upon because during the 20th century we lived with an idea of disconnection that was closely followed by competition. Nature is actually extremely collaborative and co-creative. If, for example, we consider talking about the X Prize and drawing down carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, there is a company called Blue Horizon that is looking at the way coral produces itself and grows itself from carbon in salt water. Concrete is one of the most destructive processes on the planet to produce and build that we use in the built environment. And entrepreneurs are now finding that if they push carbon dioxide at high pressure through salt water, they can actually create a replacement product that is as strong and as useful as concrete on a local basis. This is potentially the winner of the X Prize. What else can we learn from nature? Sharks very, very rarely, absolutely very rarely, get infections, bacterial infections on their skin. This is what their skin looks like. We have a huge problem currently with antibiotic resistance. We have a huge problem in trying to keep our hospitals clean of problems like RSA. We're taking inspiration from nature, and this is a science called biomimicry, to completely redesign hospital surfaces using the model of a shark's skin, which naturally repels bacteria. So nature can provide us not only with inspiration for our soul, but intelligence in how to reinvent and change our world. When we are painting colour, when we're producing clothes for colour, we use a lot of toxic chemicals. Nature doesn't. If we want to create white, we use bleach. Nature uses structure. The structure of a polar bear's skin and the structure of the beetle that you see there on the leaf, it's done by creating a structure which refracts light in a particular way and makes it look white. We're learning now from nature that the intensive processes that we have used for food production can much better be mimicked by looking at how a pristine forest works. So we're learning to produce systems like alley cropping, like agroforestry, and particularly looking at one of the most sustainable farming environments, which is prairie farming, to recreate the way that we produce our food systems in the future. If we're trying to create a different kind of business, we're also needing to create a different kind of leadership. How does nature deal with leadership? When a flock of geese are flying, and they're moving from place to place, they fly in a V formation. I'm sure we've all seen that going on in the sky. And there's a lead goose. The lead goose stays there for a small amount of time, and when he's tired, he drops back and another goose takes his place. How does an enormous murmuration of starlings move together in that amazing and most beautiful way that they do without bashing into each other and falling out of the sky? Is there a lead bird? Is there a hierarchy? The kind of structure that we have been used to creating? No. In fact, what they do is each single bird keeps an eye on its near neighbour. And when it moves, the near neighbour moves, and the next near neighbour moves, and the next near neighbour moves. What about migrations, the wild beast migration from Tanzania to Kenya and back again? Is there a single leader? No. What there is a group of older and more experienced antelope which the rest of the herd follow in a meandering motion across the Masai Mara. And what that teaches us about leadership in nature is that leadership is distributed and it's shared. And what we're seeing coming through to support this change in the way that we do business is information and insights from people like Frederick Laloux, who wrote an amazing book called Reinventing Organizations. And he has been inspired in that exponential change in human consciousness that is coming through to show how we can create organizations based on a model which reflects human consciousness at a much higher level. We have people like Otto Scharmer, who is offering us a way through meditation and contemplation to sense the emerging future rather than try to create it from the past. And so what I'd like to leave you with, from a point of view of considering activating purpose in business to create the future that we do want, rather than continuing to create the future that we don't, is what would it be like if every single business, like the ones I have described, sat with the global goals and made a commitment and a decision to see how their business could impact the global goals, the achievement of the global goals in the future? What if, instead of teaching us stakeholder and shareholder models at business schools, we were taught how to create businesses? The only businesses that would be created for the future would be those that addressed one or more of the sustainable goals. How much difference could we make to a better future if, using the global goals as a model and using business as a tool, we created the world that we want to live in rather than the world we don't? That's all I have.